What was the creepiest, unexplainable, or paranormal thing you saw in the middle of the day? My childhood home was heavily haunted. Most of the activity happened during the day, but this one incident terrified me the most. I was alone, watching my little brother. I was around 18, and he was about 2 or 3, and barely talking yet. We were in his playroom, a brightly lit area downstairs, playing with blocks or something, when he suddenly went from giggling and running around to completely freezing, staring at the entryway to the room. I asked him what was wrong, and he just pointed toward the staircase and said, "Icky noise." He'd been doing that for a while, pointing and saying it out of nowhere, clearly frightened, and I figured it was another one of those times where I'd show him nothing was there. But this time, when I finally looked closely at the stairs, there was something there. Our staircase was mostly surrounded by walls, so I hadn't noticed at first because of the shadows. But then I saw it, crouched on the step just below where the wall ended, a pitch-black shape of a person. It wasn't solid, more like a slightly fuzzy silhouette made of pure darkness, clearly looking at us through the railing. It took one step down toward us, still crouched and gripping the rails, before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. I screamed, because honestly, what else are you supposed to do? Grabbed my brother and bolted out of the house. We ended up in the backyard, sitting with my sister's dog, while I called my mom and waited for her to come home. The sightings of that thing only got worse before we finally moved out. When my brother got a little older, he was able to explain that he called it icky noise because whenever it appeared, he could hear this awful, gurgling, whispering sound. I never heard it myself, but I saw it several times, and it definitely shattered my belief that daytime meant we were safe. Story 2. This one's more heard and experienced than seen, but it still gives me the creeps to think about. When I was a kid, my family had a reunion at a big ranch venue on the Guadalupe River in Texas. The place looked and felt ancient, weathered wood, old stone, and that heavy quiet you only get in old buildings. But it was actually built in the late 70s, so not even that much older than the house I grew up in. I must have been about 8 at the time, but I vividly remember how strange that whole weekend felt. It started the very first morning. I kept hearing the sounds of children, footsteps running across the floorboards, laughter, voices, coming from upstairs in the main lodge. But my brother and I were 2 of the only kids there, and the others were all down by the river. I finally worked up the nerve to go upstairs and check. There was nobody there. The entire floor was empty. I was so freaked out, I refused to go back up for the rest of the day, and only went when I had to, at bedtime. Later that day, most of the family was down by the river, but I didn't feel like going. There was this old playground nearby, a few metal slides, some of those rickety spring horse toys that are basically whiplash machines, and an old sun-baked merry-go-round. I was sitting on it, lazily spinning and watching the water when I heard the sound of small footsteps in the grass behind me. I turned around. Nothing. The sound stopped. Creepy, sure, but I told myself to tough it out. Not even 2 minutes later, the footsteps started again, this time running straight toward me. They were quick and light, like a child sprinting. I heard them shift from grass to mulch, and then the merry-go-round began to shake beneath me, followed by the sharp clang, clang, clang of small shoes on metal. I didn't even turn around. I shot to my feet and bolted. I was running full speed when something stepped on the back of my shoe, stopping it so suddenly that I ran right out of it. I didn't look back, just kept going, as fast as I could, straight down to the river in a teary panic. I told my mom what happened. She didn't believe a word of it and made me go back to get my shoe. I was terrified, practically shaking, and she basically had to drag me the whole way. I wanted nothing to do with that playground ever again. I made it through the rest of that day without anything strange happening, even got through the night fine. But the next morning, when I woke up for breakfast, my brother had already gone downstairs. I'd been sleeping on the top bunk, and as I started to move, I heard those same small footsteps again. This time, in the hallway, just outside the room. My heart dropped. I scrambled for the ladder, but as soon as I touched it, it started to thunk and shake, like someone was climbing up toward me. I didn't hesitate. I jumped clean off the side of the bed and sprinted down the stairs. I didn't even bother telling anyone this time. I already knew no one would believe me. Years later, in 2012, I went back to that camp on a trip with a buddy. The whole place had been modernized and updated. New cabins, repainted lodge. Everything looked different. But that same old playground was still there, and it still gave me the creeps. Story 3. Back in the 90s, my brother, a friend, and I were watching TV in my parents' room. At the time, we didn't have a family television, so that's where we usually hung out. It was the middle of a summer day, bright outside, and we were between 10 and 12 years old, home alone, just killing time. Out of nowhere, the bedroom door started to rattle. We froze, watching as the doorknob began to twist back and forth. Small side note, when I was younger, I used to think that putting Scotch tape over a doorknob would lock it. It didn't set, obviously, but the tape left behind this faint, patchy residue, so you could actually see where the strips had been, and that's how we could tell the knob was really turning. Our house was the kind of place where all the neighborhood kids liked to hang out. My parents were welcoming, not strict or mean, and everyone liked my brother. We also didn't have a working lock on the front door, so people would just come and go sometimes. So when the doorknob started rattling, we figured it was one of the neighborhood kids messing with us. We opened the door, checked around the house. Nothing, nobody there. Then we thought, maybe it was one of the dogs bumping the door, but they were all sprawled out, half asleep, not paying us any attention. To test it, we closed the door again. One of us stayed on one side, and the other two stayed on the other. After a few seconds, the rattling started again. We switched places, just in case someone was pulling a prank. Same result. The door kept rattling. We finally just left the door open, and after that, it stopped rattling. And the three of us never figured out what was going on, but we all still remember it the same way, even now as adults. Years later, I was home alone, sleeping in the middle of the day since I was working graveyard shifts at the time. My bedroom door, a different room entirely, started rattling again. I jolted awake, instantly remembering that day from my childhood. This time, I just got up, opened the door, and went back to sleep. Story 4. I once saw a ghost, a man in a Revolutionary War style uniform, complete with a tricorn hat, standing at ease in my spare bedroom, gazing out the window into the backyard. It was the middle of the day, in the middle of January, and I wasn't the only living person in the apartment. It happened on moving day. My friend and I were unpacking, walking down the hall, when I saw him, clear as day. He looked solid, real. I turned to ask my friend, who was walking right behind me, if she saw him too, but when I looked back, he was gone. We named him Peter, and over time he became a fixture in the apartment. Everyone who visited knew about him. He never did anything mean or frightening, just quietly existed there, like he belonged. I'd often hear Peter pacing the hallway between the front door and the bathroom while I was in the shower, almost like he was reminding me to lock the door. Once, I actually got out mid-shower to do it, and not a minute later, our good-for-nothing neighbor started pounding on the door, rattling the knob and shouting, "Yo, you got $10? It wasn't the first time he'd asked, or demanded, money we didn't owe him. After that, I never ignored Peter's reminders. Another morning, I was walking down that same hall, which faced both the guest room and my bedroom. My boyfriend at the time was still asleep. I could see him from where I was, when I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of his dresser drawer sliding open. A moment later came the loud clatter of fishing rods falling over in his man cave. I rushed to check, but when I opened the door, everything was perfectly in place, not a thing out of order. On another occasion, my boyfriend, our roommate, and I all heard the sound of our dinner dishes crashing, the unmistakable clatter of plates falling into the sink and scattering across the floor. We bolted into the kitchen, hearts pounding, only to find everything exactly as we'd left it. Dishes neatly arranged on the drying rack, untouched. At one point, we even tried asking Peter how we could help him move on, but we never got an answer. When we eventually moved to the house next door, he didn't follow us. Still, I'll always remember him fondly. Calm, watchful, and strangely protective. Story 5. Back when I was 15, in the 90s, We used to hang out in a small patch of woods we called the orchard. It had once actually been an orchard, but by then it was just an overgrown bit of abandoned land. It was tiny, maybe 10 meters wide by 15 meters long, just a little crop of trees and grass, and that seemed kind of pathetic in retrospect. But back then it was the perfect hangout spot for us village kids. During the summer holidays, there'd usually be about 7 of us sitting around there, talking, messing around, doing whatever bored teenagers did. On one side of the orchard was an open field, and on the other, a row of houses from a nearby residential estate. One day, our group of 7 kids, ages 11 to 15, were hanging out by the fence that cut across the entrance to the orchard. The fence stretched maybe 2 meters into the woods from the open field, so it went field, fence, us, a few trees, and then more open field beyond. It was a hot summer day, and nothing special was going on. We were just leaning on the fence, talking about video games, when we started hearing noises, short, sharp impacts, like something striking the trees. It happened once or twice, then stopped as soon as we started paying attention. The sound died away, and after a moment, we shrugged it off and went back to our conversation, thinking nothing of it. Then it started again, by the same short, sharp sounds, something crashing against the trees. The impacts came every few seconds, irregular but deliberate, and, just like before, the moment we focused on them, the sound stopped. That's when we saw it. A small stone. It bounced off the top of one of the trees and dropped to the ground right beside us. All 7 of us just stared at it, completely dumbfounded. At first, we figured it had to be another group of kids messing with us. That was just the kind of dumb turf war logic we had back then. So naturally, we charged out into the open field, ready to defend our territory. But the field was empty, wide open, no cover, nowhere to hide. The trees were sparse enough that we could see all the way to the fence line, and there was absolutely no one there. We went back to the fence and kept talking, half watching the trees. The stones weren't big enough to hurt us if they did hit, just small, harmless annoyances, so it became more of a curiosity than anything else. A few more came down, bouncing off branches or landing in the grass, and we started collecting them. By the time we stopped, we had about 8 little stones piled up, and we could still hear others landing nearby. Then, without warning, a much larger stone, about the size of a cup, came crashing down between me and my friend. It slammed into the fence, rebounded, and rolled to a stop at our feet. Even at that age, we understood how bad it could have been if it had hit one of us. The rock was heavy when I picked it up. I remember wrapping my whole hand around it, feeling its weight and the rough surface. At that point, we'd had enough for the day. We left the orchard through the open field, partly determined to figure out who had been throwing the rocks, and partly just wanting to get out of there. Even 20 years later, I still don't know what was going on. The obvious answer is that someone was messing with us, but we never saw anyone in the field, and there wasn't really any other direction the stones could have come from. At the time, we wondered if maybe someone was throwing them from the other side of the fence, and they were bouncing off the trees. But when we checked, that area was just as open, and just as empty. The small stones, sure, could have been thrown from a distance. But that one big rock, it was heavy enough that even an adult would have had to be standing pretty close to get it that far. We could see every spot within that range, and there was no one there. This is pretty much the one unexplained, maybe even slightly paranormal, event in my life. It happened in the middle of the day, and none of the obvious explanations seemed to fit. I'm usually the first to debunk or question anything remotely supernatural, and I stay skeptical about every other strange story I hear. But this is the single experience that still gives me a little pause. Story 6. It happened around 10 years ago. I worked in a very old building that was mostly unoccupied, except for the basement where my office was, and the ground floor, which had a few other offices. The building was 8 stories high, and most of the empty floors still had old furniture and beds left behind from when it used to serve as student doctor accommodation. However, on the 7th floor, we stored many of our older files in metal filing cabinets. The entire building was always locked, and you needed a programmed security badge to enter and to access each floor. One day, my boss asked me and another girl to retrieve some files from the 7th floor. I can't remember exactly what they were or why they were needed, but there were plenty of ghost stories about the building, so neither of us was thrilled about being sent up there. We were going through the filing cabinets, chatting to keep ourselves calm, when we suddenly heard what sounded like a man clearing his throat, or maybe coughing, somewhere down the hallway. Donna and I froze and stared at each other for a few seconds before I finally called out, "Hello?" There was no answer. After a few more seconds passed, we laughed it off, deciding we were probably just being silly, and went back to searching for the files. A few minutes later, just as we started to feel normal again, we heard a man's voice, this time weaker and farther away than before, calling out, "Hello?" Again, we were frozen. No one but us had access to those floors. It was actually my job to program the badges, so I knew exactly who could get in. They weren't accessible to the public or to anyone else. The only way in was with a security card. Donna and I quickly left and went back to our office to tell our boss what had happened. He decided to go check it out himself. While he was gone, I looked at the security system to check the access records. No one but me had swiped in. Then a few moments later, I saw my boss's card appear on the system as he entered the 7th floor to investigate. He came back several minutes later and said the entire floor was completely empty. No one there, no sign of life in any of the rooms. That building is scheduled to be demolished soon. Story 7. I once rented a house that had been built in the early 1800s. It was in a small coastal town in Maryland where everyone knew everyone, except for me and my roommate. We had just moved in. The landlord was in his mid-70s. He and his wife had bought the property a few years earlier as an investment. We were their first tenants, as they had been slowly fixing the place up after it had fallen into disrepair over the years. We had been in the home for only a few weeks when we began to notice something strange. Whenever we met locals, they would always ask, "So do you like living there?" The question itself wasn't odd, but the way they asked it, hesitant, almost curious in a knowing way, made it feel unusual. It struck us as strange because the house was lovely. It sat on a nice corner lot, beautifully landscaped, with an updated kitchen, renovated rooms, and a private backyard enclosed by a wrought iron fence. From the street, it looked picturesque. The front of the home still had its original mortar walls and old, distressed, but carefully refinished wood floors. The middle section was an addition built around 1950, and the final addition, a large family room and bathroom, had been added in 1981. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms in each section of the house. The staircase began in the kitchen on the 1st floor and led up to the 1st bedroom in the front section of the house on the 2nd floor. Only one neighbor was actually friendly to us, a woman in her early 50s, a widow who lived alone. We asked why everyone kept wondering if we liked living there. She said, matter-of-factly, "It's been abandoned for years. Things happened there. No one wants to live there." We were like, "What the hell?" I asked what she meant, and she told us that when she was little, a boy with mental and physical issues had died in the house. Families moved in and out until the mid-80s. Then it was left empty. No one ever stayed long, maybe a few months, a year at most. We were the first tenants since the early 80s, and this was around 1996. We never noticed anything strange, probably because we were rarely home, working during the day and going out at night. Then, about 6 or 7 months after moving in, my roommate came into my bedroom late one night and asked if I had just woken up. He said I'd been sleepwalking and standing in his doorway, but I hadn't been asleep. I was reading a book. Our rooms were at opposite ends of the house, his in the front and mine in the back. I asked what he saw, and he said it was a shadow of someone in his doorway that backed away when he spoke, thinking it was me. We both freaked out. We searched the entire house. Every door was locked from the inside, every window shut tight. We found nothing. I brushed it off, thinking he'd just imagined it. He tried to believe that too. About a week later, I was getting ready for work around 7 in the morning when I heard knocking on my bedroom door. Loud, relentless, aggressive knocking. More like banging. I was pissed. "What the hell? Open the damn door!" I shouted. The banging kept going as I walked toward the door, cussing, certain it was my roommate messing around. But as soon as I grabbed the doorknob and pulled it open, the noise stopped instantly. No one was there. It couldn't have been more than a second between the sound and me opening the door. It happened 2 more times that same week, both in the morning. My roommate also saw the shadow figure once more, this time in the doorway of the 3rd addition to the house. He said he saw a dark shape move through the kitchen toward the back rooms and then simply fade away. We contacted the landlord, but he claimed to know nothing and honestly didn't seem to care. Later, we talked to the woman across the street and told her what was happening. She said a family who lived there before us had similar experiences, and banging on walls and doors, and even something grabbing their kids hard enough to leave bruises. People had suspected child abuse, but the family moved out not long after. After about 8 months of living there, we got a notice in the mail that the landlord had passed away and his son was selling the property. We were told to move out as soon as possible. He sent back our security deposit, along with the first month's rent as compensation for the short notice. That was my one and only paranormal experience. Story 8. Back in May or June of 1998, my family and I were at my nanny's house, clearing out some of her things. She lived right on the water in Rhode Island, a small 1-story home with a cramped floor plan. She always sat in the kitchen at the island, right in front of the refrigerator, which blocked the way to the hallway, bathroom, and bedrooms. It was her usual spot. She had passed away just a couple of months earlier, in April, from a stroke. My parents were loading up my younger sisters, and I was the last one still inside the house. I stood in the kitchen, which had a clear view down the hallway into the bathroom. Just as I started to head for the door, I heard the water faucet turn on, full force. One moment, there was total silence. The next, the sound of rushing water filled the house. Confused, thinking someone was still inside, I called out. No answer. I walked down the hall and found the bathroom empty, the water blasting from the sink. I turned it off, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. It was the middle of the day, maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I still remember the smell of the toothpaste she used to keep there, the sunlight filtering through the stained glass window, and the bar of soap sitting next to her toothbrush as I reached out to shut off the tap. I ran straight out to the car because my parents were already annoyed that I was taking so long. I told them what happened, but no one believed me. I still think about that day. I wish I'd gotten to know you better, and maybe helped you feel less lonely. Edit to add. Other creepy things happened too. My mom once hired a psychic to come over so she could try to talk with her parents, but the psychic ended up turning to me instead, saying she was hearing from a good friend of mine who died in a car accident. She said, "He says, thank you for hugging my mom." That absolutely freaked me out, and still does. During the whole mourning period, I couldn't bring myself to hug his mom, not once. I finally did, months later. No one knew that. No one. And I was deliberately keeping my answers short, just yes or no, so I wouldn't accidentally give anything away. But that psychic, she was spot on about everything. Story 9. There's one event that still really bothers me. It happened about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was asleep in bed. That day, school started at 9:30 instead of the usual 8 o'clock, so I figured I could finally catch up on some sleep. But that morning, I was jolted awake by a sound that felt like an explosion, or maybe a cannon blast. Unbelievably loud and close. My whole room shook, and almost everything in it rattled. Then came 2 more shots, just as powerful, each one making the walls tremble. I was half awake, totally confused, trying to figure out what was happening, but I was also exhausted. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a dream, and went back to sleep. Still, it bothered me all day. At school, I asked my friends if they'd heard anything. The blasts, the shaking, anything. But no one had. Not a single person knew what I was talking about. Only one other person heard it, someone who also started school at 9 that day. He said he'd heard the same thing, and was just as confused. The strange part was that he lived about 10 kilometers, roughly 6 miles, away from me. So whatever that sound was, it had to be incredibly loud. I even asked the father of my ex-girlfriend from that time. We lived only about 2 kilometers, around 1.25 miles apart, and he'd heard it too. He was home at the time and told me it sounded exactly like a howitzer firing from a few hundred meters away. Since he worked in the military and had been deployed multiple times, I trusted his judgment. After that, I stopped believing it was just a dream. Here's the funny part. Even though several of us heard those blasts, no one ever seemed to talk about it. There was nothing in the news, no reports, nothing. It was like it never happened. Then, a few years later, I came across something strange. A letter posted at the entrance of a subway station in another part of the city. The letter was written by someone asking if anyone else had heard a loud bang, one so powerful that it made their whole room shake. Reading it gave me chills. Someone else had experienced the exact same thing. Not long after that, a local news outlet published an article about the same mysterious sound. They'd even managed to record it, and when I listened, it was almost identical to what I'd heard that morning. To this day, it still bugs me. I have no idea what it was, but I know it was real. Story 10. I have one, maybe not the scariest or creepiest thing ever told, but it definitely stands out for me. When I was about 13, my 2 friends and I were hanging out and decided to take a walk along the trails through the woods near my house. We wandered around for a while before deciding to leave the actual trail, head deeper into the forest. It wasn't a big deal. If you walked in any direction for about an hour, you'd hit a road, so we weren't really worried about getting lost. After a few minutes, we stumbled upon an abandoned shack. It looked kind of like a garage, just sitting there in the middle of the woods, with no visible path leading to it. It was strange. I'd been walking and biking those trails my whole life, and had never seen or even heard about it before. Curious, we opened the door and went inside to look around. Inside was an old boat, with, weirdly enough, a brand new engine attached to the back. Even stranger, the entire place was half filled with junk, about 2 or 3 feet of random debris covering almost the entire floor. Being dumb teenagers, we were weirded out, but still decided to explore the place. There was a second level, also covered in piles of random junk. Eventually, after the initial curiosity wore off and the unease set in, we decided it was time to leave. That's when things got weirder. Like I mentioned before, if you walked in any direction for about an hour, you'd eventually hit a road. We didn't want to do that, and then still have to walk all the way back to my house. We were lazy, but since we just wandered off trail, without paying much attention, we couldn't remember which direction we'd come from. Luckily, we had walkie-talkies with us. We'd mostly been using them to call each other names earlier, but now they seemed like they might actually be useful. All 3 of us grabbed one, picked a direction, and started walking. I guess we all happened to mess around with the channel dials at the same time, because none of us got very far before stopping. One of the channels had this sound, a woman, absolutely sobbing. These deep, heavy sobs with muffled words between breaths, though we couldn't make out what she was saying. The moment we all heard it, we sprinted back toward each other, panicked, asking if everyone else was hearing the same thing. Sure enough, the crying was coming through every one of the walkie-talkies. We tried for about 45 minutes to get the woman to respond. We kept asking if she was okay, what was wrong, if she needed help, but she just kept crying. Deep, ragged sobs, over and over. I think at one point, there was even someone else on another channel who said he could hear it too on his walkie-talkie. Eventually, after maybe 30 minutes or so, the channel went completely silent. It took us a while to find our way out of the woods, and we were creeped out the entire time. We never heard anything about it afterward. No reports of missing or injured people, nothing at all. Story 11. This happened a few years ago. It was early afternoon, probably around 2 o'clock on a Saturday. My dad and I were standing in the kitchen. I was at the counter, a sort of breakfast bar that's higher than the rest, making a sandwich. He was standing behind me, and to the left, near the doorway by the fridge. We were talking about something I can't even remember now when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. I looked up from my sandwich, and directly to my right was what had made him stop, a floor-to-ceiling shadow, roughly cylindrical in shape, and about 2 feet wide. I immediately turned to face this thing as it swiftly and silently glided straight past me, moving in front of the kitchen window, completely blocking the light, and then straight through the wall. I looked at my dad, completely speechless, but managed to ask if he'd seen it too. He just nodded. I walked past him into the hallway, then into my parents' room. Whatever that thing was, it would have had to pass through there on its path, but there was nothing. We spent a while trying to figure out what could have caused a floor-to-ceiling shadow like that. We were completely stumped. Both of us have experienced the paranormal before, but this one stood out, silent, solid, and impossible to explain. As an interesting side note, the wall that shadow passed through led directly into the master bathroom. My dad has actually seen an apparition of his mother-in-law standing in the doorway of that same bathroom before. He's also told me that when he was very young, he used to see strange little men, almost like gnomes, in his parents' house. According to him, they weren't always friendly. That house still gives me an uneasy feeling, even after all these years. Story 12. This one's more creepy and unexplainable than outright scary. Whenever I tell it, I usually call it the time I met a CIA agent. I used to work in retail and had the opening shift that morning.
It was early.
Around 7 o'clock, so there weren't many people out and about yet. I opened the doors at 7:30. At about 7:35, a man walked in. He looked frantic. His clothes were wrinkled and unkempt, so I figured he might be homeless. That immediately put me on edge. Honestly, I thought I was about to get robbed. He came up to the counter, glanced around, and asked where the bathroom was. At that point, I assumed he wanted to shoot up or something. Whatever, not the first time, and definitely not the last. I made it a rule not to piss off junkies before 10 in the morning, so I just pointed him toward the bathroom and went back to making sure the store was ready for the day. He headed into the bathroom. A few minutes later, 2 men came into the store. They looked around for a moment, glanced at me, then toward a car parked just outside. They didn't really say much, just a quick hey, before pretending to browse. Now, we never got customers that early in the morning. Usually, the first few people started coming in around 8, and things didn't really get busy until 9. So seeing 3 men in the store before 7:45 was already weird. One of the 2 new guys walked over to the bathroom door and tried to open it. Locked. I said nothing. They didn't ask why, and I sure wasn't volunteering any information. Like I said, before 10 in the morning, I keep my mouth shut. The 2 men eventually left. A moment later, the first guy came out of the bathroom, but he looked different. His clothes were much cleaner, better fitting. His hair looked neater, and even his posture had changed. He just gave me a quick nod, calm and composed, and walked straight out of the store. I've thought about that moment at least once a day in the 4 years since I had that job. It wasn't until the next day that it really hit me how strange the whole thing was. To this day, my only conclusion is that I somehow witnessed a spy operation or something along those lines, because honestly, that's exactly what it felt like. If those kinds of things ever have a feeling, that was it. Story 13. I was working in the North Georgia mountains, doing land surveying with my boss. As we wandered through the woods, we both got quiet, which wasn't unusual for us. But then everything around us went silent too. No birds chirping, no cicadas or crickets humming, no squirrels rustling through the brush, just absolute stillness. We both knew that kind of silence isn't a good sign. We looked at each other, uneasy, and then started to hear whispers, soft, indistinct, like voices just out of reach. We couldn't make out any words. We kept walking, and then, clear as day, we both heard a single loud word, stop. We froze immediately, saying nothing. Looking around, we noticed 4 graves, Native American, from the markers, and realized we were about to walk right over them. We packed up for the day. As soon as we got back to the truck, the forest sounds slowly returned, like someone had turned the volume back up. Nothing strange happened when we came back to finish the project, but that day still sticks with me. Story 14. I had just moved into an old house in rural Pennsylvania, and it was the definition of creepy, big, worn, and with a weird floor plan that never quite made sense. I'd already had a few unsettling experiences there at night. Footsteps, the feeling of being touched, but the most memorable one happened in broad daylight. The layout of the house was strange, 3 rooms in a row, with 2 of them connected by a middle room that had a door at each end. I was sitting on the couch in that middle room when I suddenly heard a loud bang from the room to my left. A second later, there was a bang on the connecting door, then the window opposite me, then the other connecting door, and finally another bang in the first room, like something unseen had sprinted straight through the house, pounding on everything as it went. Startled, I shouted, "Quit banging on shit." And if it was a ghost, I guess it listened, because there weren't any more bangs after that. Story 15. I have a coworker who claims she has something like a portal in her house, a place where spirits travel through. Now this woman is about as logical and level-headed as they come, so it genuinely surprised me that she believed in things like that. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge ghost show fanatic myself. She also claims that sometimes the spirits follow her to work. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just part of a casual conversation. Then one day, I brought my son to work. It was just the 3 of us in the store. Her, my son, and me. I was standing behind the closed-off counter area when, out of the corner of my eye to the right, I saw a little boy about my son's height with blonde hair. I caught just a glimpse of his clothes as he passed between 2 aisles. I called out to him, asking what he was doing. When he answered me, he was still sitting on a stool on the other side of the closed counter, saying he'd just been playing his video game. That's when it hit me. For him to have been in that aisle on my right, he would have had to come all the way around the left side of the counter and pass right by me, same for getting back to his seat. The 2 spots were far apart, and there's no way he could have covered that distance in the few seconds between when I saw him and when he replied. My coworker looked me dead in the eye and said, "You just saw him, didn't you? He followed me to work today." Then she described the kid, every detail exactly right, even though I hadn't said a single word about what I'd seen. Story 16. To this day, when I tell people about my breathing doll, they don't believe me. They say it was just my imagination, or that I must have been dreaming. But I know what I experienced was real. It's one of the most vivid memories of my childhood, and easily the strangest. I first saw the doll at a flea market. I was there with my mom and grandmother when I spotted it. A big doll, about 14 inches tall, and I fell in love instantly. I begged my mom to buy it, but she said no. Thankfully, my grandma gave in and bought it for me. I adored that doll, and I treated him like he was a real baby. I bought him tiny clothes, shoes, bottles, everything. I named him Rocky, and I took him everywhere with me. People would often mistake him for my baby brother because I carried him around so carefully. One day, I was outside playing with Rocky and being a little too rough, tossing him up in the air and letting him fall, scolding him when he wouldn't sit still on my bike. Finally, I threw him as high as I could, tried to catch him, but he slipped through my hands and hit the ground hard. I bent down to pick him up and dust him off, and that's when I heard it. Breathing. It was heavy, fast, and angry. The kind of sound someone makes when they're furious, but trying not to shout. I froze, staring at him, my whole body shaking. Then I screamed, dropped him, and ran inside. My mom asked what was wrong, and I told her. She just laughed, said I was being silly, and told me to go get him and bring him inside. I refused, screamed when she tried to make me. There was no way I was touching that doll again. My mom finally gave up arguing and went to pick him up herself. She looked at me and said, "See, he's just a doll, stuffing and plastic. He's not real. He can't breathe." That was the last day I ever played with dolls. Later, I gave Rocky to my brother for a home economics project where he had to carry around a bag of flour and pretend it was a baby or something. He actually used Rocky's head and attached it to the bag to make it look more realistic, and ended up getting extra credit for it. A few years later, all the Chucky movies came out, and killer dolls were suddenly everywhere. Meanwhile, I just kept thinking and didn't need a movie. I'd already had a demon doll of my own. Story 17. I'm fairly sure that anyone who camps often will agree with me that the forest at night can be a pretty eerie place. There are so many sounds that don't seem to belong to any animal. I usually brush them off as the wind or a strange echo. But about 5 years ago, I went camping in the Southern Alps and set up my tent just inside the tree line. After about 2 days of exploring, hiking, enjoying the scenery, and doing a bit of caving, I began to feel as though something was around me, not following me exactly, but surrounding me. I figured I was just tired or dehydrated, but when night fell on the 3rd day and I was lying in my tent, I started to hear branches snapping and leaves rustling in a way that didn't sound natural. It's true that branches sometimes break under their own weight or because they're rotten, but when I woke up and checked the trees, I saw marks about 15 feet high, and it wasn't just one tree. Many of them had the same marks. On the 5 trees closest to my tent, there were also scratches at the same height. I was pretty scared at that point. I couldn't tell if some local was playing a prank on me, or if something more sinister was happening. I had a knife for protection, but I packed up quickly anyway. Being a 5-foot-tall woman who barely weighs 120 pounds, I wasn't about to take any chances. Before leaving, I checked the trees and the ground one last time. There were no footprints, no disturbed foliage, nothing. Whatever had marked the trees hadn't touched the ground at all. As I started heading back toward the valley, I heard a sound, something between a deer's cry and a man's voice. It was so unnerving that I immediately started running downhill without looking back once. Even though I'm not religious, I clutched the crucifix my grandmother gave me so tightly that my palm began to bleed. The whole situation was terrifying, and the worst part was that no one believed me. When I asked the locals if anyone lived up there, or if anything strange had ever happened, they ignored my questions and avoided eye contact. Story 18. I didn't see anything, but I definitely heard something. When I was in high school, I was responsible for getting myself to school, since everyone else in my house left early for work. One morning, my alarm didn't go off, and I woke up in a panic when I realized how late I was. I rushed straight to the bathroom to brush my teeth, and that's when I heard it, clear as day. A woman's voice from the hallway said, "You're going to be late." She sounded firm, almost like she was scolding me. The house was completely empty, except for me. Caught off guard, I looked out into the hallway, but there was nothing there. I went back to what I was doing, trying to convince myself I hadn't really heard what I just did. It didn't make any sense, so I tried to ignore it. Just as I began to feel calm again, the stereo in my dad's room suddenly turned on and started blasting music at full volume. I walked to his room and stood in the doorway, looking around. Naturally, I was pretty freaked out, but I told myself the stereo must have some kind of alarm feature going off, except it didn't. When I turned it off, I saw there was no alarm setting on it at all. For the rest of my time living in that house, I never experienced anything strange again. This happened more than 10 years ago, but I can still recall the sound and tone of that voice as clearly as ever. Story 19. This is a story I've told many times, and over the years I've heard plenty of theories about what it could have been, but I've never gotten an explanation. I was sitting in geography class in the Netherlands, just paying attention to the lesson from my awesome teacher. There was one person sitting next to me and 2 classmates in front of us. Everyone was focused on the teacher, along with about 28 other students scattered around the room. The teacher asked me a geography question, and I started answering it. The whole class was looking at me while I talked. You know, Earth this, climates that, the usual stuff. Then something strange happened. The girl sitting in front of me, who was looking straight at me as I spoke, suddenly reacted to something in the empty space between us, right at about eye level. Now it's really hard to describe what happened next, but I'll try my best out of nothing. This bright white flash appeared. It's about 10 centimeters wide. It made a strange grinding noise, kind of like when you rub 2 pieces of styrofoam together. It didn't look like electricity or anything I could recognize. The only way I can explain it is that it reminded me of that scene in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, where Hermione fixes Harry's glasses, that glowing fluid sort of energy coming out of her wand. It looked a bit like that, but smaller. At that point, I remember thinking, what the hell, am I having a stroke? But it wasn't just me, everyone saw it. This thing appeared right in front of my face, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke. It moved in this strange, shifting way, like it was morphing into something else, but never quite becoming anything. I completely froze and asked, "What the hell? Did you guys see that?" The people around me, including my teacher, were just as shocked. Everyone nearby saw it. After the flash, a very sweet smell lingered in the air, and strangely, it stayed there for weeks. The whole place felt different after that. We were all baffled, but eventually just shrugged it off. Still, I couldn't sleep that night, replaying it in my head and trying to make sense of it, especially because so many others had witnessed it too. Does anyone have any idea what this could have been? I'd really appreciate any thoughts or explanations. Happy to answer questions if it helps. Nothing like that ever happened again. Story 20. Back in 2013, I worked in a really old warehouse in Dallas. One day, I was in the bathroom, just sitting there peeing, when I heard a squeak and saw the faucet turn itself on. The handle moved and everything. It actually happened a few times before the company eventually moved to a newer building. I always got creepy feelings in that place and never felt completely alone, even when I was the only one in the room. About 10 years ago, I was living in an apartment with an old ex. One day we were sitting in the bedroom talking when something caught my eye. I glanced over and saw this thing. The best way I can describe it is as a very faint grid made of shadows, hovering a few inches above the floor. It was about 1.5 feet across, and it rotated and sort of strobed for just a split second before vanishing. I stopped talking mid-sentence, and he looked at me and said, "You saw that too, right?" My theory is that it was some kind of glitch in the Matrix, or maybe a brief glimpse of a dimensional portal. Back in May of 2003, one of my dearest friends passed away. It nearly destroyed me. I missed him so much and cried for months. On the morning of my birthday, in January of 2004, I was out running errands and happened to end up near the cemetery where he's buried. I decided to stop by and visit his grave. I had my Palm Pilot plugged into my car stereo, playing music. The moment I drove through the cemetery gates, it suddenly switched, right in the middle of the song that was playing, to one of the songs from my friend's funeral. I have no non-paranormal explanation for how that could have happened. The song that was playing was stored in a completely different folder from the one it suddenly switched to. Bluetooth controls didn't exist yet, so there was no way I could have accidentally hit skip or anything like that. The music player app wasn't on shuffle, and I hadn't touched the device at all. Even if it was just a glitch, what are the odds that out of the 1,000 or so songs I had on that PDA, it would switch exactly to one that was played at my friend's funeral, at the very moment I drove through the cemetery gates to visit his grave? I truly believe that was my friend's way of letting me know he's still around, a quiet sign to remind me not to be so sad anymore. Story 21. There's this ghost we call Edward. We always thought he was attached to the house, until I left for college. That's when my roommates started telling me they'd see a man standing in the doorway. It scared them at first, but they'd laugh it off later, thinking they must have been dreaming. Back in high school, it happened to me too. I'd come home late after hanging out with friends and see my dad in the window, waiting for me to get home. But when I'd walk inside, he'd either still be at work or already asleep. I've lived with a painful condition called CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome, my whole life. It's excruciating, and I've spent countless days and nights in bed crying. But no matter the time, I'd sometimes feel a hand touch mine, or gently rub my back or leg, at the leg that's affected. It used to terrify me, but I came to realize Edward wasn't there to hurt me. Once, a deaf friend came over to hang out at my house. A little while after he left, he texted me and my mom saying, "You have a ghost. You know that, right?" A few times, I could actually see him pretty clearly, sitting on the couch or standing in my doorway. The family dog would be lying on the couch, tail wagging, clearly enjoying pets and scratches from someone invisible. Now that I've moved out and live with my boyfriend in an apartment, my own dog does the same thing sometimes. More recently, a few strange things have happened. One afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I'd taken some medicine and laid down for a nap. My boyfriend was at work. I suddenly felt someone shake me awake, and as they did, I heard a voice say, "Dogs, be for people. Wake up." I jolted awake, thinking my boyfriend must have come home early, but then I heard someone trying to get into my apartment. Whoever it was got scared off. When I called out, "Baby, is that you?" My mom thinks it might be my great-grandfather, someone I never got the chance to meet, but honestly, we don't really know. He only shows up every so often now, instead of all the time. Every now and then, my best friend will text me saying, "Call Ed, don't show me you're here," because she can sometimes feel a presence, but hasn't actually seen him since. But yeah, it's definitely some man. He looks like he used to be in the military. All I can really make out is an old-style uniform. Once or twice I thought I saw jeans instead, but I'm never sure if that's my brain playing tricks on me. I don't even know if spirits can change their appearance like that. It's creepy and a little scary, but also kind of comforting. Mostly it's the people close to me who get spooked, hearing things bump around, seeing my dog act like she's getting pets when no one's there, or catching a glimpse of him out of the corner of their eye. But I know he's not here to hurt me, so I'm not too worried about it anymore. I also want to add that one morning, I fell halfway down the stairs because they were iced over. I was on my way to work, and my boyfriend wasn't home. My only neighbor on that side of the building had already left for work too, and I couldn't get up. I have a herniated disc and had just had a procedure done, so I wasn't very mobile. For a moment, I honestly thought I was going to freeze before anyone found me, but as I tried to pull myself up using the railing, I felt what seemed like hands under my armpits, lifting me just enough to help me get back up. So, thanks Edward, whoever you are. You've been there for me, and probably saved me more than once. Story 22. This isn't something I experienced personally, but I wanted to share it, because it's stuck with me ever since my mom told me about it last year. When I was a kid, about 26 years ago, my grandma got very sick and eventually passed away. I don't remember much from that time, just bits and pieces. But last year, my mom told me more about what really happened. The details she shared were eerie, spiritual, and deeply sad. I could write them all out, but it would take a long time. Still, there's one thing she said that I shall never forget. "I miss my mom. When y'all were little, you know she had already passed away. I was so depressed that I didn't want to be around anyone or anything. When you were in school, I would cry and cry at home because I missed her terribly. I would spend weeks grieving. Then one noontime, I fell asleep on the couch. I had a rocking chair in front of me. Anyway, in my dream, I was in limbo. I saw a human figure, but I could barely make it out. I couldn't move or do anything. The environment was dark and eerie, almost foggy, with mist everywhere. There was a faint light above the human figure, and I saw it slowly coming toward me, floating in a chair. It was my mom. She was dressed in ragged clothes, and her skin had an ashen color. She rocked back and forth in the chair. Her head lifted, and I saw that she was facing me, but her eyes were lifeless. Then she spoke in her natural voice, echo-like, telling me, "My daughter, do not weep for me. I am at peace. At last, I am no longer in pain. I am with the Lord. You'll be okay. You have your sons. Live for them." I opened my eyes and felt strange, unusual, and uncomfortable. I didn't get up, but I moved my eyes around the room because I was a bit confused about where I was. Then I looked at the clock. It was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. When I looked straight ahead, I noticed the rocking chair moving, as if someone had just sat on it and gotten up. I was by myself, and y'all were still in school. Story 23. When I was young, I used to stay at my grandmother's home on Jamaica Avenue in Brooklyn. One day, I was playing in the backyard, riding a red and yellow plastic tricycle. I still remember the sound of the wheels scraping against the concrete as I rode in circles, while my mother watched over me. At the far end of the yard stood a garage that had belonged to my late grandfather. As I played, both my mother and I were suddenly startled by an extremely loud roar and a heavy bang against the garage door. I remember falling over from the shock of how hard the door was hit. The sound was like a roar, born of pure hate and anger, something like a tiger's, but deeper and more menacing. My mother panicked, scooped me up, and ran inside the house to get my uncle. I remember him rushing out with a bat, throwing open the garage door, only to find it completely empty. The garage was padlocked from the outside, and nothing inside had fallen or shifted that could have caused such a violent noise. My uncle shouted a challenge to whatever might have made that sound, but there was nothing. The space was still and silent, with only a few tools neatly hanging on hooks along the walls. Story 24. A couple of weeks ago, I went across town to visit my mom and my elderly grandpa for a few days. Late one night, everyone had gone to bed. I was in my old bedroom. My mom was in the one to the right of me, and my grandpa was in the room to the left. I was messing around on the internet around 3 a.m. with the window open when I heard a woman's voice in the distance. No big deal. Probably someone outside yelling for some reason. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, I realized it was a familiar voice, calling a familiar name. It was my mom's voice, calling for me. It happened a few more times over the next 10 minutes, so I decided to check on her. I looked into her room, and she was sound asleep, lying on top of the bed. Over the next hour, I kept hearing that same voice, still my mom's, calling from what sounded like 200 or 300 feet away, somewhere in the direction of the backyard. I forced myself to ignore it, assuming I was just overtired and imagining things. Eventually, I went to bed and told no one about it. End of story, right? The other day, I went back over to visit again. While we were talking, my grandpa mentioned something that stopped me cold. He said that the last time I'd been there, he thought he'd heard a familiar-sounding woman calling out late at night, around the same time I'd heard the voice, coming from the same general direction. What the hell were we hearing? What the hell were we hearing? Story 25. Way back in the day, I lived about 14 miles from town and around 40 miles from the city. Needless to say, it was the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where silence had its own weight. It was a sunny summer afternoon. My sister and I were about 11 or 12 years old, playing Twisted Metal 4 in my bedroom, which faced east. From the window, we could see the driveway, maybe 10 feet away, and the open field beyond it, about 50 feet out. While we were playing, we glanced outside and saw a man digging in the field, right next to our dog's kennel. Our cocker spaniel was in there, but strangely, he wasn't barking or reacting at all. That was immediately weird. That dog barked at everything. The man was wearing an orange shirt under a pair of blue denim overalls. We figured it was our neighbor, who had a bad habit of wandering onto our property and doing odd things without asking. So, we tried to get his attention. We tried yelling to him and to the dog, but neither of them moved. The man didn't even look up, and the dog just sat there, completely still. I grabbed my pellet gun and went outside, heart pounding but determined to protect my sister. The second I stepped out, I felt it, that creeping sense of being watched. The air felt heavy, and my skin prickled with fear. I crept around the side of the house, scanning the field. The man was gone, and nowhere to be seen. My pulse was racing as I looked toward the spot where he'd been digging, but there was nothing there. I called out to my sister through the window, asking where he went. She kept pointing to the same spot, but when I looked, it was completely empty. She said she could still see him, clear as day, standing there and watching me. I couldn't see a thing, just the field, still and quiet, but I could feel him. That same sharp, crawling fear ran down my spine. I bolted back inside. My sister and I grabbed whatever we could, the pellet gun, a couple of old swords we had, and looked back out the window. There he was again, standing in the field, staring straight at us. Eventually, we decided to go out together. My sister holding the sword, me gripping the pellet gun. Adrenaline overrode fear as we pushed each other forward, walking toward where the man had been. We were ready to confront him, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing. No man, no hole, no dirt pile, not even a single patch of grass looked disturbed. The field was untouched, as if no one had ever been there. We hurried back inside, locked every door, and searched the entire house, every room, every closet. Then we called our mom and sat in the living room, literally back to back, weapons in hand, until she came home several hours later. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.